All right, welcome to the SPE Podcast. I'm Trent Jacobs, and today I'm talking to Mathias Carlsen. He's a petroleum engineer consultant and general manager with Whitson, which is a software and consulting company that specializes in some pretty cool oil and gas research. In the last couple of years, he's authored and co-authored, 5 SPE papers? Did I have that right? And I've seen him present a couple of these recently, so I wanted to have him come in and talk about it. First, we're going to get into everybody's favorite topic, shale EOR. I also hope to get him to speak about a very kind of wonky issue, but we're going to see if we can have fun with it. It's called Separator oil shrinkage and what that means. All right, Mathias. So we met, it's 2 or 3 months ago. We met in November in Florida with our friend Saga Wisdom. So I just wanted to give a big shout out to our friend John Thompson and his whole crew. Then I saw you again last week in Saudi Arabia. And the funny part is that we probably worked just a few miles apart here in Houston. And this happens to me all the time. You know, I have to fly around the world or go to another state to meet somebody that works, 10 blocks away from me. We brought you in because you've had some pretty interesting takes on shale EOR, and you have a really good high-level perspective on this, and also you get right into the weeds whenever I see you speak on this. So this has been a hot topic since 2016, I believe, since EOG first broke the news that it was doing Huff-n-Puff gas injections. Ever since, everybody's been captivated by this topic. What is your take on this? It's 2020. Where are we now with shale EOR?
Since 2016, I think that was kind of the first call it pivoting moment when EOG presented these investor slides on the topic. But since then, you've seen a lot of things happening, but it's been happening a little bit slow, I think, for at least for a lot of the audience. But things is definitely happening. In the Eagle Ford, you have EOG, you have EP, Marathon, ConocoPhillips, Murphy, and so forth, doing piloting and projects throughout the Eagle Ford. But you also have things going on in the Permian with Oxy, Chevron, these other basins with Continental in the Scoop Stack, Liberty in the Bakken, and so forth. So I think things is happening for people working on the topic, probably also in the industry. People like yourself as well think it might be moving a little bit slower than what we initially hoped. I've been working on this probably since 2016 in all these different places, and I'm kind of, not disappointed, but a little bit, set up from the fact that, it's been taking 4 years from 2016, and we haven't seen more than maybe 200 wells tested so far. And I hopefully in the next 5 years we'll see, a quadrupling maybe of that.
I think what's interesting is, and you speak to the impatience, and as we were talking before we came on, sort of as a reporter, as a journalist covering the industry, it has been an exciting but also sort of frustrating topic. And I was saying that, generally, I've only found myself doing like one big, kind of in-depth feature on this topic a year at most, because the information doesn't come out so much, and there isn't a lot of progress. And I'm wondering, in part, is that because we're so spoiled on the fast-moving ship that is the U.S. shale revolution, even though it's kind of hitting rocky waters, to keep the analogy going. But we're spoiled with a really fast-moving sector, and then yet EOR is stuck in R&D phase for 4 years, going on 5.
That's spot on, essentially. That's the same. That's how I view the situation as well. I think it's important to acknowledge that things is really happening. It's not only on the research level. It's not only Huff-n-Puff. There's also all these other things that's happening with jewelry being put downhole, with interesting completion schemes. They call it. Type of frac-to-frac technology, where they try to inject in every other fracture. For instance, you have, surfactants added to the injection gas to decrease the mobility of the injection gas for conformance issues. So things is moving in the right direction, and I'm very sure that we're going to get there pretty soon. I think it will be interesting to see the next few years whether or not it's going to take up or not.
What are some of the big things we've learned that may help people sort of understand, the nuances here, the context that you're giving? Are there have we held on generally as observers to misconceptions about this practice, and that's why a lot of people are saying, well, why don't they scale up? Why don't they move faster? These pilots, and then when you hear somebody from maybe EP talk about it, you realize, whoa, this is a lot harder than it seems on the face of it. I mean, these pilots are not straightforward.
Yeah, and that's true. And I think, what they've underestimated so far is how much gas you actually need to inject into these pilots.
Draw me a picture there.
Just to take you an example, some of the pilots that they've been conducting in the Bakken, they're injecting a few million scuffs per day. While the successful cases that we've seen in the Eagle Ford, they're injecting 15 million scuffs per day. That's an order of magnitude in increase. And that's what you've seen that is required to get any type of economical uplift or any uplift at all, actually. So that's one part of the things that I think has been surprising for a lot of people. And I think the thing that has to probably increase in terms of orders of magnitudes when it comes to the operational side is how much gas you inject. I always draw the analogy to the early days when we started hydraulic fracturing, that you completed a well with 10 stages, and now we're talking, if you count the number of clusters in a lateral, it might be 200. So you need to get the same order of magnitude increase also in terms of how much gas you inject in these pilots. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you have to deal with this conformance issue that seems to be an issue everywhere. Also,
are those two related, the amount of gas and the conformance?
Yes, so you can say conformance is essentially how much of your gas that you inject into the wellbore is leaking out into other wellbores surrounding the pilot, right? To this day, at least from all the people I speak to, from all the pilots I've been analyzing and so forth, every single pilot, whether or not it's the Eagle Ford, if it's the Bakken or whatnot, you see the wells are communicating downhole. That's also related to this entire, well spacing issue and so forth. And the fact that they're communicating isn't necessarily negative, but you have to be able to repressurize the reservoir. And if all the gas is leaking out to other wells that might be producing, you won't be able to pressurize that system. So I think there's two things that's been surprising for a lot of people is actually how much gas you need to make it economical, and the degree of how much they're struggling with these conformance issues. The way I've seen they've solved that practically, it's very simple. Is that they essentially inject gas at very, very high rates, maybe into one wellbore, where they have a pad with between 8 to maybe 16 wells. And then they see that all the offset wells are starting to pressurize up, and once they pressurize, they starting to shut in the offset wells, and when the offset wells are shut in, they keep on doing that until you don't see any conformance issues or any type of communication downhole on the wells that are even further away from the injection.
Is this typically just on a pad, or are you seeing cases where it's pad to pad? So we're talking about long distance conformance issues there.
Yeah, so you definitely see that as well, and a little bit of the problem is that around an injection pad, you don't necessarily you don't own the neighbor pad sometimes, right?
Right.
And if you I have to give a big shout out to Hess actually, that if you look at what they delivered and are going to start now in 2000 and end of the year, I think, up in the Bakken, they're actually owning the pad and the lease, or the DSU as they call it up there, and all the leases also around the injection pad. And that's very good, because even if some of the gas is leaking out, you at least own the offset land, so you're able to monitor it. You actually get the gas back, or there's actually someone else. If that wasn't the case, someone else would actually make money of the gas you were injecting.
It's interesting because it also suggests it sort of to me it says that you need to be somewhat of a medium. Mid cap to a super independent here to really play in this space much, because of these kind of considerations, which is that if you're up in the Bakken or the Eagle Ford, you have natural fractures, you have induced frac hits that are long lasting, and you still don't have an X-ray vision of the field. So it sort of, this practice seems to lend itself to the bigger players.
Yeah, and I think that's, it's not only the bigger players, you need a lot of continuous acreage. I think that's key. The second thing is that you also, it's very beneficial if you own the pipeline infrastructure on surface.
This was the big advantage for EOG. which I've been told, during when times got lean, they didn't sell their midstream infrastructure, and that's why they're able to supply themselves with that much gas. So that's a huge bottleneck in itself.
Yeah, not only on the commercial side, you can utilize the gas better and whatnot, but it's also on the logistical side, because if you have to depend on third-party, gas suppliers and renegotiate contracts and marketing contracts and these things every time you want to inject in a well, and sometimes you don't know how much gas you need to inject or for how long it will take until you build up that pressure, and many times you have some kind of target pressure, which is in general, as you want to go as high as you can when it comes to this bottom hole pressure, building up that pressure until typically some safety factor of the fracture initiation pressure.
Don't go over the frac gradient. You don't want to refract these wells.
Yeah.
You want to maintain the conductivity as it is.
Yeah, and sometimes it's actually regulated by the local government, so you're not allowed to, which is the case in for instance, Canada. But yeah, so that's essentially that.
One piece of advice that's been given out by practitioners here is, if you're going to try to get through this pilot process and deal with all these uncertainties that we've just covered, do it on an unbounded, sort of the first well on the pad, the H1 well that doesn't have anything near it for half a mile or whatever. Does that speak to you? I mean, would that way you would get that first contact, you'd be able to sort of like run the economics a little bit better and run a pilot quicker. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely. And I see, some of the companies that want to do these pilots, they go for these big lease DSUs where they inject a lot of gas and all the wells are communicating. Here we can talk like 25 wells could communicate when they start to inject.
And at that end, that's bad news.
Yeah, because the reason why it's bad is it's very hard to quantify. Then it's like, what wells are you actually going to include when you're going to provide a baseline for forecast? Because you always have to compare it to, whatever these wells are going to produce anyway, right? Mm-hmm. But if you have an unbounded case with also very good metering, topside, it's much easier to first of all provide a benchmark for future production, and you don't get this kind of a noise from all these offset wells. And in addition, you will be, you should expect to have a much better pressure buildup, which is also good for testing out the scheme in more controlled environment.
Is the data also cleaner for modeling from that point on as well too?
Yeah, for sure. So for modeling as well, many times these wells are allocated, so you don't actually have necessarily super good resolution on your measured data for every single well. So there are some of these uncertainties that you kind of ignore if you do it on an unbounded well, and it's also cheaper because you don't have to inject that much gas, since there's only one well that you need to inject into.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come right back to this topic and some other things.
SPE is now accepting nominations for outstanding work in the E&P industry. Take a moment to help nominate your colleagues for the recognition they deserve. The International Awards deadline is 15th of February, and the Regional Awards deadline is the 1st of March. For more information, visit spe.org/awards or click the link in the show notes.
So Mathias, I wanted to ask you a couple more questions about EOR before we move on. One of them that's come up in my reporting, and I wanted to see if this squares with you, is that when we talk about shale EOR, another roadblock here to sort of the scalability of this practice is that this isn't the core practice of the shale sector. This is a drill and complete world that we live here in the lower 48. And this is being said a lot from the podium, including Tom Blasingame, the next president of the SPE in 2021, who said, the shale industry needs a lot more reservoir engineers. And when you look at shale EOR, this is very much a reservoir engineering specific domain. Does the sector have enough accrued experience and talent in that area to move faster? Is that an issue, a bottleneck?
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, what you said there, what Thomas said earlier, and it's also something I get from kind of the community of reservoir engineers that's out there, that this requires something else. It requires modeling, research on the topic, and so forth, which might not have been the name of the game, at least initially in the shale space. But also back to what we talked about earlier, you need the players that can actually have the scale, the infrastructure, and especially the gas volumes to carry this out. And if you look at the companies that actually has a lot of reservoir engineers, they're typically the bigger players as well. And you definitely have seen a change, at least from my perspective, where these companies are recruiting more and more people with detailed and long-lasting reservoir engineering experience.
Well, I presented sort of a review of our findings to an SPE group last year about this topic, and I got called out during the Q&A session because I didn't mention, CO2 flooding, and I didn't mention what you can do surfactants. So to please, sort of that crowd, let's move away from Huff-n-Puff just for a minute. And what is happening on the surfactant front and the CO2 front? We hear a lot less. And then even in Canada, people are talking about just using liquids for shale EOR. So how are these things going?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. So for CO2 is fairly simple because no matter what you want to do, whether it's CO2, liquids, or surfactants, volume is key. You need the scale, and when it comes to CO2. These contracts, I talk to people talking about CO2, and it's like, yeah, we can do all this stuff, we can do these experiments, we can do the simulation with CO2, but if you go out and ask your marketing folks, you won't be able to get CO2 the next 10 years. So CO2 is kind of like the privilege of a few players that has that and have had that historically, namely being Oxy and similar companies like that in the Permian. Surfactants is something. Again, that you need a lot of scale, but I've seen it, or surfactants is actually, I'm going to be honest now, because surfactants is one of the things that you always hear about at these forums, and it's a lot of papers about it, it's a lot of sales pitches about it, but
there's tons of skepticism. Let's be honest, for years.
For years, and so I'm like, or at least what we usually say is like, okay, surfactants it has never worked really commercially for conventional reservoirs.
Or the other side is that people have a hard time proving that it worked, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so you sound like you're on the fence here.
Yeah, a little bit, but I'm not going to bash too much on surfactants, but liquids in Canada is extremely interesting, and then again it's like water injection mainly that I've seen. There is some really exciting technologies out there, especially from I think a service company called NCS has been completing some of these wells where you can actually isolate every other stage or fracture for water injection and water production, such that you get this more flood-based mechanism that is what you typically have been conducting in conventionals. And
you're talking about inflow control devices.
Essentially, inflow control devices, and that's been extremely exciting to see some of the results there early, been presented at different forums and whatnot. Looks very promising, and again. But it's water, and again, you need scale. And if you think about how much water you use to frack these wells, which is like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of barrels to fracture one well, you need the same type of volume and scale if you should be able to do some kind of EOR. Yeah. So so just to sum up, I think key, no matter what you want to do, EOR scale is important, and then you need to look at what's the most costly. Or cost efficient. So what do you have the most available close to your pad, that you can put down in your wellbore, and typically that's natural gas, associated gas, and water.
So the horizon for these things is pretty long. I mean, you were talking about, you'll be excited to see what happens in Huff-n-Puff in the next 5 years. Some of these might have a longer horizon for scale. But the last question on this, and I've asked this and other people have asked me this. Will the shale sector ever get to a point where it's designing the initial completion, the initial drilling, design on or to prepare for EOR? Or as I said earlier, will it always remain a D&C world? EOR will have to learn how to live in it.
Yeah, it's going to be a combination, but I've already seen actually a couple of companies that is starting to design pads with EOR in mind. That means bigger well-to-well spacing. It's also to make sure that the high-pressure gas pipelines are going, are built close to the pads themselves, because you don't want to have pipelines with 10,000 psi pressure going across land where people live and where cows are being fed and whatnot. So I definitely see that's actually an increasing trend that I've seen very, very early in the beginning, and that I'll expect to see much more of in the future. But that said, you have 100,000 wells or whatever we have out there drilled horizontally that is not built with the gas EOR in mind. What should you do about those? You can't just leave them be, because they actually have a lot of more oil left in them, and now it's the challenge of trying to make that or recover that economically.
Okay, we're going to take one more break and then come back and explain what oil separator shrinkage is. I know everybody wants to know, and you're going to find out.
SPE members get up to a 50% discount in the SPE bookstore. Visit store.spe.org to look for your next reading material. And watch out for SPE's new book, Hydraulic Fracturing, Fundamentals and Advancement. Authors will be on site at the Hydraulic Fracturing Conference in the Woodlands for book signings.
All right, so we're back. Mathias, this is the last thing I wanted to get you to speak with us about, and I found it pretty interesting. It is sort of wonky. It does take you into the weeds a little bit, but if we were at the dinner table and I'm your great aunt Lucy, how would you explain what oil separator shrinkage is?
Yeah, so the simplest way of explaining oil separator shrinkage is essentially that all these oil and gas wells that we're producing from, where they are actually measured, so where they have a measuring tool, just as the same as you would measure, how much water is in your kitchen equipment at home. That measurement is done at what's called separator conditions, typically at wellhead, and the pressure and temperature of at those separators are higher than where you sell the oil and gas products. So from the separator conditions down to what's called stock tank conditions, your oil will shrink and some of the gas will come out of solution, which will have a big impact on economics, right? Because you would like that shrinkage to be as low as possible, such that you can sell more oil, because oil is worth more than gas in all of these places.
Okay, so you did a study on this. This was the paper I saw you present in IPTC last week in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. And one of the I guess at a high level, the big number that you threw out in the paper is that as a consequence of this phenomena, this issue, an oil company, an operator could overestimate the amount of oil they're producing on a lease or on a well by up to 20%. And so that's actually a huge percentage there.
Yeah, and the funny thing there is that it's not only like the uncertainty in your forecast, but this is actually data that you have measured and that you haven't accounted for separator oil shrinkage. So what we see a lot is essentially, and that paper was just built on a lot of practical, kind of pragmatic observations that we made, where the first one was for all these companies we work with in North America, which is like 25 plus companies, we've seen that almost everywhere people ignore separator shrinkage when they actually do history matching and call it well performance analysis. That means that potentially I've seen shrinkage factors being 50%. That means that if you think that your well is producing 1,000 barrels per day, you're actually just producing 500.
And that's largely because of shale oil. If you will, we talk about the volatile black oil window all the time. It really is volatile. I mean, it's you take it out of the ground and it's degassing. Things are coming out of solution, so that's adding pressure and that's increasing the volume that you think is in there through the flow meter.
So so there's two things there that's important, and you're onto it. The first is the fluid type is very important. Shrinkage and changes in shrinkage over time is expected to be larger for fluids that has more gas in solution. So that's volatile oils, that's near critical fluids, gas condensates, and lean gas condensates. And the second thing is actually the actual temperature and pressure of these separators, and they can change a lot over the lifetime of a well. And especially if the pressure is high and the temperature is low, you can get very, very high shrinkages. And what the other thing is also that, as I said, they can change a lot through time. And typically what you see is that the temperature changes with the seasons. So when it's hot in Texas during the summer, the temperature is higher than during the winter, and maybe even bigger changes you can see in up north in Bakken and parts of Canada.
Right, you put up a chart actually during the presentation showing the seasonal differences, and it was clear as day. You could see in the summer it's up, and then in the winter it goes down.
Yeah, and that's something you see mostly for all these wells. While the pressure typically is high in the beginning, and then it decreases together with the bottom hole pressure. And again, what's unique by these shale reservoirs is that your bottom hole pressure, so the pressure that actually gives the well potential to flow, decreases much faster than what you see in conventional reservoirs. In conventional reservoirs, you can have a constant pressure boundary, so you can produce at constant pressure forever. While here, your bottom hole pressure drops like a rock on day one, and you produce almost all the potential of your well the first 2 years. And then for a long period of time, this pressure is constant, and the separator pressure is kind of not mimicking that, but you see the same trend in the separator pressure. So the other thing about that is that your separator shrinkage factor can actually change significantly over time. While people, if they apply shrinkage factors at all, they typically apply it to be a constant factor for all the wells throughout the field.
Right, so they're taking one data point that was derived years ago probably based on a few initial wells in the field. But we've seen, I remember we were at a presentation, the one we were talking about in Florida, where I forget who it was, but it was a great picture, and he showed jugs of oil samples in the Eagle Ford on the back of a F-150, and they were all taken within about a few miles of each other, and they were radically different. I mean, you don't need to be an expert at all to see that the API gravities were totally different across these wells, and they spatially they weren't that far apart, and so a company would be more inclined under the traditional sort of system here to just apply one shrinkage factor to all of those, even though clearly these oil wells have different compositions.
Typically, the shrinkage factor is just a measurement that you take a fluid, a separator oil, you give it to some kind of laboratory, and they do a very simple flash experiment to talk tank conditions, and you get the shrinkage factor. And that shrinkage factor is something they apply constant for entire field or region, which is extremely dangerous considering that all of these wells are typically different. That's what's unique while with these shale basins. You have everything from dry gas to near critical fluids and black oils, where the shrinkage issue is probably the biggest in the near critical to gas condensate region. And the second thing is that things like API and GORs and all these things, so the producing API and the producing GORs are changing throughout time.
It's sort of the hot topic a couple of years ago was the GOR rising in the Permian. It's not going away, but it sort of caught people by surprise.
Even if you meter these rates and you've done all your work perfectly, if you don't account for those changes, even on the it's kind of crazy to me. Even data points where you have measurements, you're still off by up to 20%, sometimes even 50% if you don't account for it. And that's in a world where you at least think that you've done everything correctly. And kind of the bad news about it is that typically if you ignore it, you will just disappoint your manager throughout these organizations. So maybe that's why people are not talking too much about it.
But just to hit it home, so we talked about that high level number. You could be overestimating oil production by 20%. But this at some point these missing barrels get accounted for, right? And so that's usually at the sales end. So this issue comes home to roost once somebody discovers it, but there's information siloing happening, and then there's sort of a broad application of this shrinkage factor that needs to be customized and then optimized over time, right? Yeah. So what happens to these missing barrels when somebody realizes that maybe this lease wasn't producing that?
So typically where this is an issue is with the people doing forecasting. Because if they don't account for it while they're doing forecasting or they history match, for instance, a well using the separator barrels, then they'll think that their well is much more productive than what it really is. While again back to the siloing is that maybe operationally and practically it's not an issue because the marketing guys they get $1 million for what they sell, and they have to allocate it back to the wells, and then they just use some simple factors. But the main issue is if a reservoir engineer has thought that this region is much more prolific than it really is, and gives away all these forecasts to develop this acreage, and then you realize that you might be 20% or more off.
You framed up the problem pretty well here. And it is, I mean, I think for anybody listening, it does take you down into the weeds. It shows you how complicated these wells are, that you have to take into account how your separator works. You have to take into account how it works on Monday, on Friday, in January, and in August. And so, to tie all this up, you at Whitson and the researchers and your cadre of clients of shale producers, you guys have figured out a model that helps me. Do I have to go and tweak my reservoir and check the meter every single day? What's the solution?
Oh yeah, so the solution to this is actually very simple, and you don't need any other data than what you already have. The data, you just pull up the separator temperature and pressure from your SCADA system, which at least all the clients that we work for have that. So that's readily.
There's a few that don't have SCADA, but
okay.
But most do these days.
Yeah, most of them. So you pull that data off the separator meters, and then you have a more sophisticated model called a so-called equation of state model that describes all the fluids throughout an entire basin, and you use those two data points together with the production data to essentially calculate shrinkage factors on a daily basis. So that's something that's been successfully done, many places, in all the place. But it's just I think the biggest issue is the awareness, and even that when I did the presentation last week, there was those people coming back up to me after the presentation also when they asked the questions that these are good reminders for us because these things is typical things we don't think about, but can lead to biases and actually huge differences. And just actually trying to loop this back to what we talked about earlier with the gas EOR topic is when you do, for instance, gas Huff-n-Puff, and you inject for a period of time and then you produce back, then essentially what's happening in that 30-day period when you produce is that your bottom hole pressure is decreasing very rapidly again. When you've injected gas, so essentially the fluid composition that you're producing back is also changing rapidly. So you essentially get this entire lifetime, or the changes that you think would happen in the lifetime of a well happens in 30 days. So it like these issues with shrinkage, these issues with compositional changes and stuff like that, it's put up a couple of orders of magnitude when you do gas EOR. So if it is one place it's really important to take it into account is when you do this gas EOR project.
Just to wrap up here, because you've given us a lot to think about. How did this problem or this issue come into your view? Was this you being pulled by your operator clients, or have you guys just been wanting to look at this? Because I'm asking that just to get a gauge of how serious your clients have taken this issue.
Yeah, so it's kind of a little bit. We kind of split it into two groups. You have the clients that come to us with this as an issue because they don't have measurements at stock tank conditions, and stock tank conditions is where you kind of put the value to to the VTI and Brent and all these crudes, and also for similarly for gas. So you have the guys that come to us and asked about, what can we do to actually calculate this daily, and then you have some that we see that they're not accounting for it, so we just have to remind them about doing it. So it's kind of like a combination of both things, and for in defense for a lot of these shale companies is that you have to acknowledge that they're very, very lean on resources. They're managing, like I have friends that manage 2,000 wells. And then you can come to, and you can kind of criticize them because they're not doing this and they're not doing that, but they're doing a great job. But then you go to some of my friends that working offshore in Norway, where they have 20 people analyzing one well. And it's not fair to do that comparison. And obviously there it's much easier to account for separator shrinkage and all these things that might be of secondary priority to some of the guys over here.
Yeah, that's great context. These problems are here because shale is so new. Yeah. And that's also what makes it so exciting is that as we sort of peel the onion layers back, we learn more and more. And so, separators, if you've ever seen these things going down the highway, they're big and boring and they're expensive and they're kind of non-exact, but they come from the conventional world where they worked just fine. And then you apply them to something as delicate as the 2-year production life of a new shale well, and the game gets more complicated and you peel back another layer. And then with respect to the engineers that have to deal with all these 2,000 wells, this massive scale, my day's ruined, if I try to write 10 emails, I can't, so, if you text me, I might get back to you tomorrow kind of thing. And I'm just, a lot of respect for the work that's going on there. But at the same time, it's always good to talk about these challenges and spread the awareness, because these are problems that can be solved. People like you are trying to do that. With that, we're going to let you go, Mathias, but we're going to put the links to all your papers that we talked about here on the show notes so that people can go learn more.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we want to keep the conversation going, so please use the hashtag SPE Podcast wherever you find us on your social media. Reach out, send in your comments, and leave us some reviews on your podcast platform. We want to hear from you. And of course, we want you to read JPT online and in print, so make sure to bookmark us and keep checking in for new content. I'm Trent. See you next time.
SPE Podcast is powered by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, whose vision is to advance the oil and gas community's ability to meet the world's energy demands in a safe, environmentally responsible, and sustainable manner. Learn more at SPE.org.